All right, today we're going to trace a single, really powerful idea that runs from the very beginning of the biblical story all the way to its end. And that's the blood covenant. It's a concept that is, well, foundational, often pretty intense, and honestly, frequently misunderstood.
And look, that's a fair question, right? To our modern ears, the imagery can be a little jarring. But according to the source material, if you really want to get the central narrative of redemption, you have to understand the role of blood and covenant. So let's unpack what it meant back then and what it really signifies today.
Okay, first things first, we have got to get our definitions straight. And the source makes a really critical distinction here. We are not talking about a modern business deal. This is something, well, it's way deeper than that. Now, what's so interesting here is the mental shift it requires. You see, a contract is transactional. It's all about performance, and it has an expiration date. But a biblical covenant, as the source describes it, it's all about relationship. It's about creating a new identity, a permanent bond. In a contract, failure voids the deal. In a covenant, failure doesn't nullify the agreement. Instead, it brings in grace and restoration. Totally different mindset. The key Hebrew word you need to know is berith, and the phrase to seal it was often karath berith, which literally means to cut a covenant. I mean, how intense is that? This actually comes from an ancient practice where people would walk between the pieces of sacrificed animals. And the symbolism was just, wow. It was basically saying, may this be done to me if I ever break this bond. This was no casual promise. This was a life and death commitment. Okay, so with that definition locked in, the source starts to trace what it calls a scarlet thread, this developing pattern of blood covenant that runs right through the Old Testament. Okay, just look at this progression here. According to the source, this whole pattern kicks off back in Genesis 3. After the fall, Adam and Eve are clothed in animal skins. That signifies the very first time blood was shed to cover sin. Then you get to Noah, and what's the first thing he does after the flood? He builds an altar for sacrifice. But with Abraham, things get even more dramatic. God alone, shown as a smoking oven and a burning torch, passes between the animal pieces. He takes the entire weight of the covenant on himself. And finally, with Moses at Sinai, the covenant is sealed when blood is sprinkled on both the altar and the people, symbolically uniting them in this bond. So this pattern that was set up at Sinai, it was incredibly detailed and important, but it wasn't the final word. See, the prophets began to speak of a turning point, a promise of something that would go deeper than just external actions. And here's the crucial point. The Mosaic covenant, with all its laws and the continuous sacrifices, it could show people the standard of holiness, but it couldn't fundamentally change a person's heart. The source really points out that this whole system was always meant to be a shadow, something pointing toward a much greater reality to come. And this is the pivot. The prophet Jeremiah starts talking about a new covenant. He says, it wouldn't be like the one at Sinai that was broken. Nope. This one would be different. It would be internal. The focus shifts from stone tablets to the human heart itself. Yeah, this chart just lays it all out so clearly, doesn't it? The old system was external. It was mediated by a priest, and it was repetitive. The promised new covenant, on the other hand, would be internal, direct, and final. It promised a relationship where people wouldn't just be following rules, but they'd have this inward desire to know God, and their sins would be completely, permanently forgiven. And that brings us right to the climax of this whole narrative. The source presents Jesus, or Yeshua, as the one who doesn't just participate in a covenant. He is the fulfillment of all the covenants that came before him. Think of his final hours like a 3-act play, a covenant ceremony. First, you have the Last Supper. He takes the ancient Passover meal and gives it a brand new meaning, saying the cup is the new covenant in my blood. Second, the cross itself is presented not just as a tragedy, but as the final all-sufficient sacrifice that was prophesied in places like Isaiah 53. And third, at the very moment of his death, that massive veil in the temple is torn from top to bottom, symbolizing that the barrier between God and humanity has been removed for good. Okay, and check this out, because this detail is pretty incredible. The source material identifies 7 distinct times blood was shed during the Passion, from the sweat in Gethsemane all the way to the spear in his side. In biblical symbolism, the number 7 represents perfection and completion. So the idea here is that this was a total, all-encompassing, and perfect atonement. So what does all this actually mean for someone who believes it? Well, the source outlines a completely new reality for people living on this side of the cross.
You see, this new covenant isn't just about getting forgiven, it's about a totally new identity. Believers are seen not as servants, but as children of God. They have direct access to God's presence, no need for an earthly priest or an animal sacrifice anymore. They're given spiritual authority, and they have a way to continually remember and even participate in this covenant reality through communion. And I gotta say, this brings us to one of the most powerful contrasts in the entire source. Back in Genesis, after Cain murders Abel, God says that Abel's blood is crying out from the ground for justice. But the book of Hebrews says the blood of this new covenant speaks better things. It's not crying out for vengeance. It's speaking of mercy, forgiveness, and grace.
So we kind of end up right back where we started, but with a much deeper understanding. The entire biblical story, when you see it through this lens, is about moving from broken relationships to a permanent, unbreakable bond sealed by the ultimate sacrifice. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. In a world that pretty much runs on transactions and contracts, how might this ancient idea of a life and death relational covenant change the way you see your most important bonds?